Okay, so back to part 3 of this module 5 lecture on sustainable diets. For this lecture dated November 2nd to 6th. And the first 2 modules, I gave you sort of a story from the University of Alberta that helped us think about the way that science, the conclusions that may be drawn from kind of cherry picking results from scientific papers, even if the methods for the analysis were fine, the way that we cherry pick results is important. And the way that those results are represented can lead to very misleading conclusions. I then went into a similar story about the environmental impact of dietary choices by looking at the Tom and Fishback study and the response by Kim. So I'm going to share my screen again. Okay. So what is fair comparison if we're evaluating environmental impacts of diets? We shouldn't just throw up our hands and conclude that that doesn't matter, or that who knows what would be a less environmentally damaging diet. We have to think about what we're comparing what with what. So when the Tom Fishback and Fishback study compared the current diet with the USDA reference diet, recommended diet. We think, let's keep that in mind, because there are other ways, many ways that those diets contrast with each other, and the environmental impacts might be surprising about what caused those changes. And then on what basis are we comparing our diets? Is it going to be things like units of consumption? Is it per plate? Is it per kilogram of food produced, kilogram of food consumed? Is it calories? Is it protein? There's all kinds of ways that we can be comparing food, and we need to keep that in mind. What I find interesting is all of these studies that we'll show, so there's I'm going to show you a number of studies. Almost all of them actually use the same baseline information. So these are kind of in fact, and this is an interesting paper by Heller and colleagues, who looked at greenhouse gas estimates of US dietary choices and food losses in 2014. This is some of their paper, the results, which actually are not in that paper, but in the supporting information. So you have to kind of look for it. You can't find kind of easy to access sources of this information, but this information is really pretty standard, and people have collected it, and it's really not questioned. What's questioned is what the data is used for. So here's a table which shows us average across a number of variety of studies. Average greenhouse gas emissions measured in kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of output. So that's important to think about, is the output per kg of something, per kg of output. So we've got grain products, fruit, legumes, and different protein, animal-sourced proteins. And you can see that clearly, in terms of average, beef and lamb are much higher per kg of beef or lamb, CO2 equivalents, than any other food type. The animal source foods are high, but not as high as beef and lamb. So pork and veal, for example. And then what are much lower are legumes. So you can think about legumes as a protein alternative to those animal-based protein supplies. And you can see a massive difference, right? Differences of maybe 30 times between the two, or at least between 10, 30 times. And also fruit and vegetables being quite low compared to fruit, vegetables, and flours and rice, all quite low compared to the animal source foods. So this is unequivocal if we're measuring, if we're worried about GHGs and we're thinking about that in terms of, say, pounds or kgs of food. this results are quite clear. But then how else should we measure things? Is CO2 equivalence the only thing we're worried about? It's important, but we're also worried about things like water use and land use. So that's fair that other studies will bring those in, as did the Tom Fishbeck study. We may not be worried just about production, but about consumption. So that might be, there might be differences, might be large amounts of waste, for example, of one type of food compared to another. So we might want to delve into that more, more fully. It may be the amount of food which is available for consumption, so before waste, but after manufacturing, in which case we should be thinking about sort of this life cycle. So kind of where are we in the life cycle? So this gets us back to life cycle analysis. And then how are we going to compare, if we settle on one impact, one environmental impact like greenhouse gas emissions measured in CO2 equivalents, it's that per what? Per kg of food, as I showed you in the previous table, or for example, kg of protein, in which case would have to consider the differences in protein composition of different types of foods. That might be very important if we're comparing plant-based protein sources with animal-based protein sources. So that easy comparison I provided in the last one we might want to dig into that more. It might be energy, like the Tom and Fishbeck study. They looked at calories. So made for some comparisons, if you're comparing, wheat and rice, that might be relevant. It may be the type of meal or the type of diet which is implied by a meal. So that's an important comparison for people who face day-to-day choices about what meal to consume, like people who live at university residences. Or it might be relative to kind of a standard unit of a different type of diet. So if we looked at if there were an average of, say, 2,000 calories per person per day, what would be the amount of CO2 equivalents of producing, of cost impact of producing a diet that had a 2,000 kilocalorie but had different compositions. Okay, and we can really find all of those in the literature. So I show for protein consumption, there's a study by Dyer that did comparison of animal and plant protein sources. That's important to think about. What they conclude is that it's important to have a variety of protein sources to get all of the essential amino acids that we need. So probably not just one type of protein source, but maybe a mixture of proteins, whether they be plant and animal proteins. If we look at energy consumption, then we may have fair comparisons, but we may have ridiculous comparisons, like comparing lettuce and pork in terms of calories. We may think about comparing an ideal diet versus the actual diet. And what we see from that is that there's many differences between ideal and actual diets that have to be taken into account, and therefore it's really challenging to figure out what part of those diets are most important. In terms of a meal choice, I'm going to show you results from a Chen paper that was done at a US university cafeteria, Canadian university cafeteria, which is very relevant, I think, for people in your situations. And the Scarborough paper that looked at actual diets of actual UK consumers whose diets fit into different categories of high meat, medium meat, low meat, fish, vegetarian, vegan, and reached conclusions on that. So I just kind of went through this. Here's the Scarborough et al. Paper. about comparing the 6 types of diets and the greenhouse gas compositions for the diets that were consumed on average by men and women based on a standard of 2,000 kilocalorie diet. You can see the estimates for men and women quite similar, with the greenhouse gas impacts being 2 to 3 times higher for high meat eaters than for vegans. So there's a clear hierarchy here in terms of environmental effect. And then if you took that out to the level of a 4-person family that had different dietary habits, you could see the CO2 equivalents per year. And you see these numbers, and I compare these in the note at the bottom. I compare these numbers for a 4-person family to the average UK family, the average emissions associated with the UK family from air travel, heating, electricity, car transport, and waste. You can see that's 8.1. So you can see how important our diets are for our total greenhouse gas impacts of our activities. And so food is really, really important. Someone who was thinking about the greenhouse gas impacts of their lifestyle would do well to look at their diets. This is something that they, as well as things like, are they taking the bus, or are they driving their own transport, and are they taking international trips? Okay. This is the last specific study I want to share with you, which is a study by Chen and al. At the McGill University Cafeteria. And this is an interesting place to make really fair kind of comparisons that swap different elements of dietary choices. So they have compared 2 representative meals, a stir-fry base that people can choose and then have different protein sources added to that stir-fry base, or a lasagna that also has all the same ingredients with different choices of protein alternatives. So these are actual choices that face students when they stand in the line at the cafeteria. They're choosing which protein source to go for that particular meal. Chen et al. Then looked at the recipes for these different plates and the ingredient lists, and then use that standard information that I provided at the beginning of this mini lecture to estimate the environmental impacts measured in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, water use, and land use for each ingredient. They considered for the McGill case, so they brought it right to the McGill case, so they tried to use as the most relevant information. So they used field grown, they looked at alternative origins, and they looked at high and low estimates, and they considered emissions of moving, transporting those foods to Montreal from wherever they were produced. The conclusions then were, you see here, this is greenhouse gas emissions per kg of these different ingredients, which go into this, into one of, which one of them? Into one of the, I guess this is the stir fry, into that stir fry. So they've got, you see the smallest greenhouse gases per kg of tomato being for tomatoes, and the largest being for beef, as we've seen elsewhere. So beef being larger by a factor of at least 3 compared to cheese, or that much higher than, say, eggs and chicken. So there are large differences among the protein sources, and pork is relatively low compared to beef, still much higher than, say, lentils, probably a factor of 10 lentils or chickpeas, which would be the plant protein alternatives to those animal-based proteins. So we put that together in thinking about how do those greenhouse gas effects vary by where the products came from. And you can see for all of the protein products, it really didn't matter much, whether it was sourced locally or from greenhouse gases or from greenhouses. Basically, few of these products would be sourced from greenhouses, sorry. And on the left side, you can see, and we've done something wrong here. Okay, sorry. Compared to the stir fry on the right side, and the lasagna on the left side. So for the lasagna, it did matter, where for the stir fry, given the ingredients, it didn't really matter where they were sourced from. So this is a interesting source of information that the products which were in the lasagna, which were grown in a local greenhouse, had significantly higher greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so for cafeteria users at McGill, these choices are pretty stark, right? There's significantly larger greenhouse gas emissions associated with them choosing animal sources of protein compared to plant sources of protein, and then within animal sources of protein, pretty large differences between, say, eggs and poultry on one hand and beef on the other hand. So just reaching one more conclusion, and we covered this paper back in Module 1 in the introduction by Jessica Fanzo, who looked at the ethics of healthy, sustainable diets. And her conclusions are that across the board, you really can't equate less environmental impact with more healthy. So healthy does not equal sustainable. Neither does sustainable equal healthy. So we have things which may have less environmental impact, might be diets which are healthy, that have more fruit and vegetables and less animal source foods, less sugars, more plant-based proteins that replace beef with pork or chicken. There also are diets which have low environmental impact, which aren't healthy, which aren't great for our health. Those are things, diets that have low diversity of ingredients, where most of the energy is from starches and grains. High sugar and low micronutrients are not well-balanced diets. These might be the diets you see on the lower impact, environmental impact might be the diets in many developing countries, and the more healthy but less environmental impact, more possibilities for wealthier places. We can also have higher impact, environmental impact, healthy diets. So if we have high amounts of dairy, high amounts of lean meats, high amounts of fish, nuts, fruits and vegetables, low amounts of processed foods and sugars, all of that adds up to a diet which is healthy, but does have, under current production conditions, has more environmental impact. And more environmental impact and unhealthy is just when we eat more of everything, and especially when we're eating more animal-sourced meats. So overall conclusions from this is that if you're looking for, there are good sources for looking at the environmental impact of your dietary choices, but you need to be pretty cautious. You need to think about real like comparisons, that changes that people actually make or that actually hold in a population, as the Scarborough paper looked at actual diets of UK residents, and the Chen et al. Paper looked at actual comparisons of McGill students at the cafeteria. We need to think about the fact that, yes, protein sources have huge impacts on the GHG emissions of diets, but that isn't all. There also are many other elements of diets which have higher or lower GHGs. For example, sugar has high calories and low environmental impact. So the sugar composition of the diet may be very important as well. The stories that make the most headlines often make the most problematic assumptions and comparisons. So when you see that lettuce is worse for the environment than bacon, then think that through. and that what may have happened is that someone has cherry-picked the results or amplified certain results, and those results actually may not be, those comparisons may be bogus. And then finally, just back to this, the unfortunate story is not all healthy diets are sustainable, or all sustainable diets healthy. And we'll get into that in more detail with this Eat Landsat report about, so what is the choice? So I'm going to stop. Okay, I stopped sharing. I'm going to stop recording.